The heat in West Texas during the summer of 1847 wasn't just oppressive, it was vindictive. It pressed down on the land like a curse, turning the earth to powder and the air to needles. Along the Rio Pecos, where the mesquite trees twisted like arthritic fingers and the dust devils danced across barren fields, men spoke in hushed tones about disappearances. Travelers who left San Antonio bound for El Paso never arrived. Prospectors who ventured too far from established trails were found weeks later, their bodies stripped and scattered, their eyes still open as if witnessing something that refused to let them close. Ezekiel Turner didn't concern himself with such tales. Fear was for lesser men, for those without the will to impose order on chaos. Turner was a farmer in name only. His true crop was dominion. His property stretched across 300 acres of scrubland that yielded more thorns than cotton, but he worked it with the fervor of a man proving something to God or perhaps to himself. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. He had come to Texas from Georgia 5 years prior, bringing with him 12 slaves, an iron will, and a reputation for cruelty that preceded him like a foul wind. The other settlers gave him wide berth. In the tiny settlement of Langtree, population 47 souls on a good Sunday, Turner was known but not welcomed. He attended church irregularly, paid his debts slowly, and treated his neighbors with barely concealed contempt. But it was his treatment of his property, both human and animal, that truly set him apart. "That man's got the devil in his blood," Martha Coopersmith whispered to her husband one evening as they watched Turner drive his wagon through town, the wooden slats rattling, dust rising in angry clouds. "Mark my words, Henry, the Lord don't look kindly on such meanness." Henry Coopersmith, a blacksmith who'd shoed Turner's horses more than once, just nodded and kept his eyes on his work. In West Texas, you learned early that some men were best left alone, their sins between them and their maker. Turner's farmhouse sat at the base of a low ridge, a squat structure of adobe and timber that seemed to hunker against the landscape rather than rise from it. Behind it stood a barn that leaned perpetually to the left as if trying to escape, and behind that, connected by a length of chain that could have moored a riverboat, was where Turner kept his greatest prize. The Apache warrior had been found 3 weeks earlier, half dead from a bullet wound in his side, collapsed near a dried-up creek bed 15 miles west of Turner's property. 2 of Turner's field hands had discovered him while searching for a missing calf. They'd nearly run when they saw the man's size. Even prone and bleeding, he seemed impossibly large, his frame suggesting something carved from the landscape itself, rather than born from it. Turner had ridden out himself when word reached him, bringing rope and chains and 3 armed men. The Apache was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his bronze skin slick with fever sweat. Turner had stood over him for a long moment, his shadow falling across the warrior's face. "Look at the size of this one," Turner had said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man who'd found money in the street. "Must be near 7 feet. Never seen an Indian this big. Probably worth keeping alive, at least for a spell." They'd loaded him onto the wagon bed like cargo, chains wrapped around his wrists and ankles. The wound in his side still oozed blood, staining the wooden planks. One of Turner's men, a nervous fellow named Pike, had suggested they just finish him, that keeping a wild Apache was asking for trouble. Turner had fixed Pike with a look that could freeze whiskey. "I decide what's trouble on my land, Pike. You got a problem with that. You can collect your wages and move along." Pike had gone quiet. Nobody ever collected wages from Ezekiel Turner and lived to spend them comfortably. The Apache had woken 2 days later in the barn, chained to a support post with enough slack to sit but not stand fully. Turner had watched from the doorway as consciousness returned to those dark eyes, eyes that the other slaves would later describe as the color of a storm rolling in from the west. Deep gray, with flecks of something lighter, something that caught the light, like distant lightning. "You speak English, boy?" Turner had asked, though the man before him was clearly no boy. Even seated, even wounded, the Apache radiated a presence that filled the barn's shadows. No response. Just those eyes, fixed on Turner with an intensity that should have warned the farmer, should have sent him running. But Ezekiel Turner had spent 53 years believing that chains and will could conquer anything. Don't matter if you understand or not. Turner continued, stepping closer. You're on my property now. That means you're my property. You work, you eat. You cause trouble, you don't. Simple as that. The Apache's expression never changed. He didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge Turner's words in any way. It was like talking to stone, to something elemental and unmoved by human posturing. Turner had smiled then, the kind of smile a cat gives before it plays with a caught mouse. We'll see how long that pride lasts. A few weeks in the Texas sun, a few missed meals, you'll come around. They all do. But weeks had passed, and the Apache, whom the other slaves began calling Nantan after one of them overheard Turner's Mexican hand whisper the name, remained unchanged. He worked when forced, moving with an economy of motion that suggested strength held carefully in reserve. He ate what was given without complaint, but also without gratitude, and he never, ever spoke. The other slaves kept their distance. There was something about Nantan that unsettled them, something beyond his size or his silence. It was the way he would stop sometimes in the middle of a task and turn his head toward the western horizon, his body going absolutely still, as if listening to music only he could hear. It was the way his eyes would track the movement of hawks overhead, following their flight patterns with an intensity that suggested he was reading messages in their paths. It was the way the horses would refuse to approach him, how the dogs would whine and slink away when he passed. "That one ain't natural," said Moses, Turner's oldest slave, a man who'd survived 40 years of bondage through a combination of wisdom and invisible compliance. "Got something in him that don't belong in chains." "Everything belongs in chains if the chain's strong enough," replied Samuel, younger and still bitter with the injustice of his station. "Massa Turner just another fool white man thinking he can own the whole world." "Maybe so," Moses had said, his eyes following Nantan as the giant warrior hauled water from the well, the chain trailing behind him like a metal snake. "But that one there, he ain't part of this world we in. He part of something older, something that was here before the white man, before any of us. You can see it in how he move, like he just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Moses had shaken his head slowly. "Nothing good for Massa Turner, that's for certain." Turner took particular pleasure in displaying his prize. He would have travelers detour to his farm specifically to see the chained Apache, charging them $1 for the privilege. They would stand at a safe distance, these merchants and ranchers and military men passing through on their way to somewhere else, and stare at Nantan as if he were an exotic animal. "Caught him myself," Turner would lie, his chest puffed with false bravery. "Took 5 of us to bring him down, fought like the devil, but even the devil falls to good Christian men with purpose." Nantan would endure these exhibitions without reaction, his face a mask of granite, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the gawking visitors. But those who looked closely, and few did, might have noticed his hands, how his fingers would slowly clench and unclench, how the muscles in his jaw would tighten almost imperceptibly. The summer deepened, and with it came the kind of heat that drove men to madness. The Rio Pecos shrank to a muddy trickle. The mesquite trees seemed to huddle closer to what little moisture remained. Livestock died in the fields, too weak to even seek shade. And in the barn behind Turner's farmhouse, Nantan grew thinner but no weaker, his silence becoming something almost tangible, a presence that filled the space around him like gathering pressure before a storm. Turner's other slaves noticed changes, small things at first. The chain that held Nantan would sometimes be slack in the morning when it had been taut the night before, suggesting movement that shouldn't have been possible. Scratches appeared on the barn walls, marks that looked like symbols, or perhaps maps, drawn in something dark that might have been blood or might have been mud. And the sounds, low, rhythmic sounds that came late at night, like chanting or singing, but in a language none of them recognized, sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He calling to something, Moses whispered one night to the others as they huddled in their quarters, calling to his people maybe, or maybe to something else, something that listened. "You talking nonsense, old man," Samuel replied, but his voice carried no conviction. They'd all heard the sounds. They'd all felt the change in the air, like the pressure before lightning strikes. Martha Cooper Smith's words proved prophetic in ways even she couldn't have imagined. The Lord might have been watching, but so was something else, something older than churches, something that remembered when the land belonged to different gods and different laws. On a night when the moon hung red and low over the horizon, when the heat still clung to the earth like a fever that wouldn't break, Ezekiel Turner made his final mistake. He had been drinking, which was common, and he had been losing money, which made him mean. He'd stumbled out to the barn, lantern swinging, to take his frustrations out on the only thing he could still dominate, or so he believed. The other slaves heard the shouting, heard Turner's voice raised in drunken anger, heard the crack of a whip, and then something else. A sound like chains under terrible stress, like metal crying out against force it was never meant to withstand. Then silence. The kind of silence that makes the air itself seem to hold its breath. And in that silence, somewhere in the darkness beyond the farmhouse, beyond the barn, out in the endless expanse of Texas scrubland, something answered. A sound like thunder, but thunder that walked on two legs. Thunder that had been patient. Thunder that was patient no more. The morning came slowly to the Turner farm, the sun rising reluctant over the eastern ridge, as if it too sensed something had changed in the night. Samuel was the first to emerge from the slave quarters, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard-packed earth floor, his mind already cataloguing the day's labors before his eyes were fully open. But when he stepped into the yard, his mental list scattered like cottonwood seeds in wind. The barn door hung open, swinging slightly on its leather hinges. That wasn't unusual. Turner was often careless about securing things, especially when he'd been drinking, but there was something about the quality of the opening, something deliberate, that made Samuel's throat tighten. And then there was the silence. No rooster crowing, no sounds from the animals. Just an oppressive quiet that pressed down on everything like wool soaked in water. "Moses," Samuel called, his voice barely above a whisper. "Moses, you need to see this." The older man emerged, followed by three others, Jacob, Ruth, and young Thomas, barely 15, but already carrying the broken-backed posture of someone who'd learned that the world had no mercy for people who looked like him. They gathered in a loose cluster, their eyes moving from the open barn to the main house, where Turner's bedroom window remained shuttered despite the growing light. "Where the animals at?" Ruth asked, her voice thin with confusion. "Can't hear nothing. No chickens, no pigs, nothing." Moses had already started walking toward the barn, his movements slow and deliberate. The others followed, though none of them could have explained why. It was as if they were being pulled by something, drawn toward whatever revelation waited in that darkness. The interior of the barn was wrong in ways that took a moment to fully comprehend. The support post where Nantan had been chained stood intact, but the chain itself lay in pieces on the ground, each link separated as cleanly as if it had been cut with tools, though the metal showed no signs of sawing or filing. It had simply parted, given up, released its burden, as if the bondage itself had decided to end. But that wasn't what made Moses stop breathing. Turner's lantern lay on its side in the corner, still burning low, casting dancing shadows across the barn walls. And on those walls, painted in something dark and viscous, were symbols, dozens of them covering every available surface. They seemed to move in the flickering light, to writhe and pulse with their own rhythm. Spirals and lines and shapes that hurt to look at directly, that made the eyes want to slide away and focus on anything else. "Lord, have mercy," Jacob whispered. "What is all this?" "This is language," Moses said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "The Apache. This his writing, his prayer maybe, or his curse." Samuel moved closer to the symbols, squinting in the dim light. Some of them looked like animals, birds in flight, snakes coiled, something that might have been a bear or might have been a man standing on hind legs. Others were more abstract, geometric patterns that seemed to suggest movement, migration, the passage of something from one state to another. "He was telling a story," Ruth said suddenly. She'd always been the observant one, the one who could read meaning in the smallest gestures. "Look here." She pointed to a sequence of symbols that ran from floor to ceiling. "This here's a journey. See how it starts small and gets bigger? That's him. That's Nantan, starting as a boy and growing." They followed her finger as it traced the progression. The figures indeed seemed to grow, to expand, to take on more detail and complexity as they climbed the wall. And at the top, just where the barn roof began its slope, was a symbol larger than all the others, a man with arms outstretched, surrounded by what could only be interpreted as lightning, and beneath him, scattered like broken toys, were smaller figures that might have been men, or might have been something else entirely. "We need to find Massa Turner," Thomas said, though his voice suggested he already knew what they would find. They discovered the farmhouse first, or what remained of it. The structure hadn't just burned, it had been systematically destroyed. The adobe walls were cracked and crumbling as if something had struck them with tremendous force. The timber supports were snapped like kindling, scattered across the yard in patterns that suggested violence of a very specific nature. And the roof, the heavy wooden beam and tile roof that Turner had bragged could withstand any storm, lay in pieces, arranged almost artfully around a central point of destruction. The front door had been torn completely from its frame and now rested 50 feet away, embedded in the ground like a gravestone. "Nobody could do this," Jacob said, his voice shaking. "Not one man, not 10 men. This ain't natural." But Moses was already moving toward the ruins, his face set in grim determination. He'd seen evil in his life, seen cruelty and violence and degradation that would break most men's spirits. But this was different. This was something that transcended human evil, that operated on a scale that made human cruelty seem almost quaint by comparison. They found Turner in what had been his bedroom, or rather, they found what Turner had become. The farmer lay on his back in the center of the destruction, surrounded by the rubble of his life. His arms were spread wide, his legs straight, his body positioned with clear intentionality. But it was the details that would haunt them, that would infiltrate their dreams for years to come. Turner's head had been crushed between 2 stones, large river rocks that must have weighed 40 pounds each. They'd been placed with precision on either side of his skull, and then pressed together with such force that the bone had given way like an eggshell. His face was unrecognizable, a mass of pulped flesh and splintered bone, but his eyes remained open, staring upward with an expression that managed to convey both terror and resignation. His mouth hung open, and from it spilled Texas dirt. Good, red, West Texas dirt, packed so tightly into his throat and mouth and nasal passages that it was clear he'd either been suffocated by it or forced to swallow it in his final moments. His hands were clasped together on his chest, fingers interlocked in a parody of prayer, bound there by what looked like strips of his own shirt, tied so tightly that the fabric had cut into the skin. "Sweet Jesus," Samuel breathed. "Sweet, merciful Jesus." But Moses was looking beyond the body, his eyes scanning the destruction with the practiced gaze of someone reading signs. The walls hadn't just been broken, they'd been struck in specific places, load-bearing points that would ensure maximum collapse. The furniture wasn't scattered randomly, but arranged in concentric circles around Turner's body, like rings radiating from a stone dropped in still water. And most telling of all, Turner's gun cabinet stood open and empty, the weapons nowhere to be seen, suggesting that whatever had happened, the farmer had tried to defend himself. "He fought back," Moses said quietly. "Massa Turner, he tried. You can see it here." He pointed to gouges in the floor where something heavy had been dragged. "And here." His finger indicated scratches on the remaining walls, claw marks or finger gouges, signs of desperate struggle. "Didn't do him no good, though," Ruth said, her voice flat, emotionless. She'd been Turner's house slave, had endured his attention and his appetites, had scars on her back that told their own story. If she felt any pity for his fate, it didn't show on her face. Young Thomas had wandered toward the back of the property where Turner kept his livestock. His strangled cry brought the others running, their feet crunching through the debris of the farmhouse. The fences were destroyed, every post pulled from the ground and snapped in half. The animals were gone, all of them. 10 oxen, 30 chickens, a dozen pigs, Turner's prized riding horse, even the mule that had been too old and ornery to work, vanished. But they hadn't escaped. The tracks told a different story. Hoofprints and pawprints led away from the farm in a straight line, heading west toward the Rio Pecos and the territories beyond. They moved in single file, perfectly spaced, as if the animals had been herded with expert precision. And interspersed among the animal tracks were others, human footprints, but impossibly large, each impression sunk deep into the hard-packed earth despite the drought. "He took them," Moses said, and there was something like awe in his voice. "Nantan, he freed them all, freed himself and freed every living thing on this property, took them away to somewhere better. Or somewhere worse for white folks," Samuel added, and despite the horror of the scene they'd just witnessed, several of them smiled at that. They stood in silence for a long moment, the sun climbing higher, the heat already beginning to press down on them. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, and they all turned instinctively toward the sound, toward the western horizon, where the tracks led, where Nantan had gone. "What we gonna do?" Thomas asked finally. "We gotta tell somebody, don't we? Gotta report what happened?" Moses considered this, his weathered face unreadable. They were slaves on a farm where the master had died violently. The authorities wouldn't investigate what happened. They'd investigate them. They'd look for someone to blame, someone to punish, someone to make an example of. The truth wouldn't matter. It never did. "We gonna bury him," Moses said finally. "We gonna bury Massa Turner proper, say words over him like Christian folks should, and then we gonna leave this place. We free now, whether the law say so or not. Ain't nobody coming back here to claim us, and ain't nobody gonna care about one dead white farmer in the middle of nowhere. Where are we gonna go?" Ruth asked. Moses looked west, toward where the tracks led, toward where Nantan had disappeared into the vastness of Texas. "East," he said. "We gonna go east, toward civilization, toward other people. We gonna walk until we find a place that don't know us, and then we gonna be whoever we decide to be." "And what about him?" Jacob gestured toward the ruins where Turner's body lay. "What about what he did? What about justice?" "Justice already been served," Moses replied, his voice carrying a finality that ended the discussion. "What happened here? This was justice. Maybe not the kind white folks understand, maybe not the kind that comes from courts and judges, but justice all the same. Nantan, he took back what was stolen, took back his freedom, his dignity, his humanity, and he made sure Massa Turner understood right at the end what it felt like to be powerless, to be property, to have dirt shoved down your throat until you choked on it." They buried Turner in a shallow grave behind the ruined farmhouse, working quickly and without ceremony. The ground was hard, baked solid by the unrelenting sun, and it took them 3 hours of back-breaking labor to dig a hole deep enough. They wrapped his body in what remained of his bedsheets, and Moses said a brief prayer over him, not because Turner deserved it, but because they did, because maintaining their humanity in the face of inhumanity was the only victory they could claim. As they worked, more details emerged. Turner's gun was found snapped in half, the metal barrel bent at an impossible angle. His knife, a 10-inch blade he'd used to cut the rations, was embedded in one of the barn support posts, driven so deep that the hilt had shattered. And most chilling of all, pressed into the soft earth near where his body had lain, was a single, perfect handprint, too large to be human, too deliberate to be accident, pressed down with such force that the ground had cracked around it. By mid-afternoon, they'd gathered what few possessions they had, loaded them onto a wagon they found miraculously untouched in a shed, and prepared to leave. The farm looked like a battlefield, like a place where something fundamental about the order of things had been challenged and overturned. The symbols on the barn walls seemed to watch them as they departed, those spirals and lines and impossible shapes holding meanings they couldn't fully grasp, but somehow understood in their bones. As the wagon pulled away, Moses looked back one final time. The farmhouse smoldered in the afternoon heat, sending up thin tendrils of smoke that climbed straight into the windless sky. And there, on the ridge above the property, silhouetted against the sun, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, motionless, watching. Moses blinked, and the figure was gone. But he knew what he'd seen. They all did. Nantan was still there, still watching, making sure they left, making sure the story continued, making sure the message was carried forward. Word spread through West Texas like wildfire through dried grass. By the time Moses and the others reached the settlement of Bracketville, 3 days' hard travel from Turner's ruined farm, the story had already arrived before them, carried by a Mexican trader who'd passed through Langtree and heard the tale from Henry Coopersmith. But like all stories that travel mouth to mouth, it had changed, grown, acquired details both true and imagined, until the truth and the legend had become impossible to separate. In Bracketville, they said Turner had enslaved a demon disguised as an Apache. In Del Rio, the story went that the warrior was actually a shapeshifter who'd torn Turner apart with his bare hands before transforming into a wolf and vanishing into the night. In Fort Clark, soldiers whispered that the Apache had been a scout for Santa Anna who'd been captured and tortured, and his spirit had returned from the grave to exact revenge on all white settlers. But the core of the story remained consistent. A giant Apache warrior, chained and enslaved, had broken free and destroyed his captor with such thoroughness, such brutal completeness, that it could only be interpreted as a message. The question was, a message for whom? Colonel Marcus Hendricks of the United States Army, stationed at Fort Clark, heard the story on a sweltering August evening while sharing whiskey with local ranchers. A career military man who'd fought in the Mexican-American War and harbored no illusions about the brutality of frontier life. Hendricks, nonetheless, felt a chill run down his spine as the details were recounted. 7 feet tall, they're saying, reported James Donovan, a cattle rancher who claimed to have seen Turner's farm with his own eyes. And the destruction. Marcus, you wouldn't believe it unless you saw it yourself. Place looks like God himself reached down and smote it. God or something else, added William Trent, who owned property adjoining Turner's. I knew Ezekiel. Man was hard as railroad spikes and twice as mean. Takes something special to put fear in a man like that, and whatever did this, it put fear in him all right. You could see it in how he died, mouth full of dirt, hands pressed together like he was begging. Hendricks swirled his whiskey, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. You think it was really just one Indian? One man did all that damage? The ranchers exchanged glances. Finally, Donovan spoke, his voice low. I think it was something that used to be a man. Something that maybe gave up being a man when it got chained like an animal. I think we did something out there, Marcus. We pushed too far, took too much, and something pushed back. That's superstitious nonsense, Hendricks replied, but his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. He'd been in Texas long enough to know that the land had its own rules, its own logic, that didn't always align with military doctrine or Christian theology. Maybe so, Trent said. But I'll tell you what ain't nonsense, the fact that Turner's not the only one. You heard about Jacob Stillwater. Hendricks hadn't, but he was about to. Jacob Stillwater had been a trader who operated between San Antonio and El Paso, dealing primarily in Indian artifacts, pottery, weapons, ceremonial items that he'd acquired through methods ranging from trade to grave robbery. He'd been found 2 weeks prior, 50 miles southwest of Fort Stockton, his wagon overturned and his body arranged in a manner that Trent described as ritualistic. They found him staked out in the sun, Trent continued, his voice dropping even lower. Arms and legs spread, stakes driven through his wrists and ankles. But here's the thing that'll make your blood run cold. There were objects arranged around him in a circle. Pottery shards, arrowheads, bits of ceremonial dress. All the things he'd stolen from burial sites over the years. And on his chest, carved into the skin, was a symbol. Nobody could tell me what it meant. But the Mexican soldiers who found him, they took one look and refused to touch the body. Said it was a mark of the thunder spirits, said whoever bore that mark had been judged and found wanting. Hendricks set down his whiskey glass with more force than intended. You're telling me we have a vigilante Apache warrior traveling around Texas, executing white settlers based on some kind of moral code? I'm telling you, we got something out there, Donovan replied. Something that's keeping score. And from what I hear, it's only targeting certain folks, people who've wronged the Apache in particular ways. Turner enslaved one, Stillwater robbed their graves, and there's others, Marcus. Others who've disappeared or been found dead in circumstances that don't make conventional sense. That night, unable to sleep despite the whiskey, Hendricks sat at his desk and compiled everything he'd heard. He was a methodical man, trained to see patterns, to understand tactics and strategy. And as he laid out the information, a picture began to emerge that troubled him deeply. Over the past 6 weeks, 7 men had died or disappeared in West Texas, all within a 100-mile radius of the Rio Pecos. 3 had been found dead, their bodies bearing signs of extreme violence, but also showing evidence of ritual or ceremony in how they'd been arranged. 4 had simply vanished, leaving behind abandoned campsites or homesteads with signs of struggle, but no bodies. What connected them? What made Hendricks's military mind recognize a pattern was that each of the victims had a documented history of violence or exploitation toward Apache peoples. Turner had enslaved one. Stillwater had robbed their graves. Thomas Kingsley, found with his throat cut and his body left at the base of a sacred Apache mountain, had been part of a militia that had attacked a peaceful Apache village the previous winter. Edward Morrison disappeared entirely, had been a bounty hunter who specialized in tracking and capturing Apache scouts for the army. This wasn't random violence. This was targeted, intentional, strategic. And if the descriptions were accurate, if there really was a giant Apache warrior traveling the territory and exacting this revenge, then Hendricks was dealing with something unprecedented in his military experience. An individual who had declared war not on a nation or an army, but on a concept, on injustice itself. The next morning, Hendricks assembled a patrol of 12 men, all experienced soldiers who'd served in Indian territories. Their mission was ostensibly to investigate the deaths and disappearances, to restore order and ensure the safety of settlers. But Hendricks's actual instructions were more nuanced. "I want information," he told his second-in-command, Lieutenant William Foster, a young man from Massachusetts who still believed the world operated according to rules learned in books. "I want to know who this person is, where he's going, what his pattern is. I want to know if he can be reasoned with." "Reasoned with, sir?" Foster's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. This man is a murderer. This man is a soldier, Hendricks corrected. A soldier who believes he's fighting a just war. That makes him different from a criminal, Lieutenant. That makes him dangerous in ways criminals aren't, because criminals can be scared or bought. Soldiers who believe in their cause don't scare and don't negotiate. They just keep fighting until they win, or they're killed. The patrol departed Fort Clark on a Tuesday morning, following a trajectory that would take them through the areas where the deaths had occurred. Hendricks stayed behind, but he received regular reports via courier. What those reports revealed painted a picture of a ghost, a myth, something that existed more in reputation than in fact. The patrol found tracks, impossibly large footprints that appeared and disappeared without logic, sometimes following roads, sometimes striking straight across impossible terrain. They found campsites that showed evidence of recent occupation, but contained no supplies, no equipment, nothing except a few bones from hunted animals, and more of those strange symbols carved into trees or drawn in the dust. They interviewed settlers, ranchers, Mexican farmers, anyone who might have seen something. And slowly, a more complete picture emerged. The Apache warrior had been seen by dozens of people over the past months, but the descriptions varied wildly. Some said he was 8 feet tall. Others put him at 6.5. Some reported he traveled alone. Others swore they'd seen him accompanied by wolves or hawks, or even by other Indians who appeared and disappeared like smoke. Some said he was naked except for traditional Apache clothing. Others claimed he wore pieces of his victims' garments like trophies. The only consistent details were his size, his silence, and his direction of travel. He was always moving west, always heading toward the territories where the Apache still held sway, toward the deserts and mountains, where the United States military's authority ended and older laws prevailed. Maria Gonzalez, a widow who ran a small farm near the Rio Pecos, provided the patrol with the most detailed account. She'd seen him, she claimed, 3 days prior. She'd been working in her garden at dusk when she'd noticed him standing on the ridge above her property, exactly where Nantan had stood, watching Turner's farm burn. He was tall, she told Lieutenant Foster through a translator, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. Taller than any man I've seen. And he was watching me, but not in a bad way, not threatening, more like checking, making sure I was okay, making sure I wasn't in danger. Did he approach you? Foster asked. No, he just stood there for maybe 5 minutes, and then he made a gesture. She demonstrated, raising one hand to the sky. And he was gone. Just gone. Like he'd never been there. Were you afraid? Maria had considered this question for a long moment before answering. No, she said finally. I wasn't afraid. I felt, I don't know the English word, protected, like having a guardian watching over me. My husband, he died 2 years ago. Apache raiders killed him, took our cattle. I should hate them, yes? But this one, this giant man, he wasn't there to hurt me. I could feel it. He was there to make sure nobody else hurt me either. Such accounts were common. The Apache warrior seemed to move through the territory like a force of nature, appearing to some, invisible to others, always watching, always judging, always moving toward some destination only he understood. Back at Fort Clark, Hendricks read these reports with growing fascination. He'd spent his entire military career believing in clear lines, friend and enemy, legal and illegal, right and wrong. But this situation blurred all those lines, existed in spaces between categories he'd thought were absolute. If the Apache warrior was only killing men who'd committed crimes against his people, did that make him a murderer or an executioner? If he was traveling through territory terrorizing settlers simply by existing, simply by being large and other and unchained, did that make him a threat or just a man trying to go home? If he represented indigenous resistance to colonization and oppression, did that make him a terrorist or a freedom fighter? These questions kept Hendricks awake at night, made him question assumptions he'd carried his entire life. and they led him to a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. He ordered his patrols to stand down, to observe but not engage, to track but not pursue. "Sir," Foster had protested when given these orders, "we have jurisdiction, we have authority. This individual has committed multiple murders on American soil." "On Apache soil," Hendricks interrupted. "Land that was Apache before it was American. Land that was stolen through treaties broken before the ink dried. And yes, he's killed American citizens. American citizens who had robbed, enslaved, and murdered his people. So tell me, Lieutenant, which laws apply here, ours or theirs? And if we enforce ours, what right do we have to expect them to follow them when we don't follow our own?" Foster had no answer to that. Few people did. As August bled into September, sightings of the Apache warrior became less frequent. He was moving deeper into the territories, farther from settlements, closer to the lands where his people still lived free. The killings stopped. The disappearances ceased. It was as if he'd accomplished whatever mission he'd set for himself and was now simply going home. But his legend didn't fade. If anything, it grew. Stories spread through the territories, told around campfires and in saloons, repeated by soldiers and settlers and Mexican traders. The stories varied, but they all carried the same core message. There was justice in the world that existed outside courtrooms and judges. There was power that couldn't be chained. There was revenge that was also righteousness. The Apache called him Nantan, the thunder that walks. The Mexicans called him El Gigante Justiciero, the righteous giant. The whites, uncomfortable with how the story made them examine their own actions, called him the devil of the Pecos, and tried to convince themselves he'd never been real, that Turner and Stillwater and the others had died in accidents or at the hands of regular bandits. But Moses and the others who'd been there, who'd seen what Nantan had become in his rage and righteousness, they knew better. They told a different story, one that spread through the network of escaped slaves and freed people who traveled the secret roads of the South. They told of a man who'd been treated as property and had rejected that definition so completely, so absolutely, that he'd torn apart the very foundations of the world that had tried to contain him. They told of someone who'd been broken and had healed himself through vengeance. Someone who'd been dehumanized and had reclaimed his humanity through violence. They told of a giant who'd been chained and had broken those chains and had made sure that everyone who'd helped forge them understood what their creation had cost. And when their children asked if the stories were true, they'd look west, toward the territories, toward the desert and the mountains, toward the places where America's laws ended and older rules prevailed, and they'd say, "True enough. True in the ways that matter. True enough to remember." The town of Presidio sat hunched against the Mexican border like a drunk against a bar. 170 souls clinging to existence where the Rio Grande made a lazy bend before continuing its journey south. It was September now, and the heat had finally begun to break, the evenings carrying whispers of the autumn that would eventually come, though the days still baked the earth to the consistency of pottery. Presidio had been established as a trading post 15 years prior, a place where American trappers and Mexican merchants could exchange goods without the interference of either government. It had grown slowly, accumulating buildings and residents the way a riverbank accumulates silt, gradually, inevitably, without any grand plan or design. Now it consisted of 2 saloons, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and 30-odd structures that could charitably be called homes. Into this unremarkable place walked a man who would change everything. He arrived on foot on a Thursday evening, appearing on the eastern road just as the sun touched the horizon. The first person to see him was Johnny Martinez, a 12-year-old boy tasked with watching for travelers so his father could prepare the saloon for potential customers. Johnny had been half asleep, lulled by the day's heat and the buzzing of cicadas, when movement caught his eye. At first, he thought he was seeing things. The heat played tricks sometimes, made you see water where there was only dust, made distances difficult to judge. But as the figure approached, Johnny's drowsiness evaporated like morning dew. The man was enormous. Even at 100 yards distance, his size was apparent, his frame suggesting something carved from the landscape rather than born from it. He moved with a steady, ground-eating stride that covered distance more quickly than seemed possible, and he was alone. No horse, no wagon, no supplies visible. Just a man walking, as if he'd been walking forever and intended to walk forevermore. Johnny ran to his father's saloon, bursting through the doors, with enough force to startle the 4 men drinking inside. "Papa!" he shouted in Spanish. "There's a giant coming, a giant man." His father, Emilio Martinez, had heard the stories that had been spreading through Texas all summer. Everyone had. The tales had taken on mythic proportions, had been embellished and expanded until separating truth from fiction was impossible. But Emilio was a practical man, a man who'd learned that survival on the frontier required seeing things as they were, rather than as stories made them. "A tall man, you mean?" Emilio corrected gently, moving to the window to look. "Not a giant, just a tall—" The words died in his throat. The man had reached the edge of town, was passing the church, and in the failing light, his silhouette seemed to blot out half the sky. He had to be at least 7 feet tall, possibly taller, his shoulders so broad they seemed to belong to 2 men standing side by side. He wore remnants of Apache clothing, a breechcloth, leather leggings, and across his shoulders incongruously what looked like a military coat, though it hung open and appeared several sizes too small for his frame. But it was his bearing that truly arrested attention. He walked like a king, surveying his kingdom, like a general inspecting his troops, like someone who had nothing to fear because he'd already survived the worst the world could offer. His head was held high, his gaze moving systematically from building to building, person to person, cataloguing everything without apparent concern. "Sweet Mother of God," whispered one of the drinkers, a Texas Ranger named Douglas Kent, who'd been tracking a horse thief through the area. "That's him, that's the one from the stories." "You sure?" asked his companion, another Ranger named Sullivan. "Look at him, Sul. How many Indians you know that size? How many men, period, you know that size? That's the Apache they've been talking about, the one who killed Turner and the others." The 2 Rangers instinctively checked their pistols, but Emilio moved between them and the door. "No trouble," he said firmly. "Not in my place. He walks past, we let him walk. He comes in, we serve him. But no trouble." "He's a murderer," Kent protested. "He's a customer," Emilio replied. "And you ain't the law here, Kent." "Not this far from Fort Clark. You want to start something, you do it outside, where my wife won't have to clean blood off the floors." The giant reached the saloon and stopped. For a long moment he simply stood there, looking at the building as if reading its history, from the worn wood and faded paint. Then, moving with surprising delicacy for someone his size, he ducked his head and shoulders and entered. The interior of Martinez's saloon fell silent. The 4 drinkers, Emilio, 2 Mexican workers who'd been playing cards in the corner, Johnny still clutching the doorframe, all of them froze, held in place by the sheer presence of the man who'd just entered their space. Up close, he was even larger than he'd appeared outside. His head nearly brushed the ceiling beams, his shoulders seemed to fill the entire doorway. But it wasn't just his size that commanded attention, it was his face. He was young, perhaps 25 or 30, though experiences had carved lines that suggested a much longer life. His features were sharp, aristocratic in a way that suggested lineage and heritage that predated European concepts of nobility. His eyes, those eyes that Moses and the others had described as storm-colored, moved across the room with the same systematic assessment he'd given the town. Noting positions, evaluating threats, understanding the space with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned survival in places where inattention meant death. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Water," he said in perfect English. Please. The please broke the spell. Emilio moved to the bar, poured water from a pitcher, and set the glass on the counter. The giant crossed the room in 2 strides, picked up the glass between thumb and forefinger like it was a child's toy, and drained it in a single swallow. He set it down carefully, exactly where it had been placed, and looked at Emilio with what might have been gratitude. "More?" Emilio asked. A slight nod. The giant drank 4 more glasses, each downed as quickly as the first, before finally setting down the glass and releasing a quiet sigh of satisfaction. Then he reached into a pocket of the military coat and produced a silver dollar, which he placed on the bar. "For the water, and for any trouble my presence causes." His voice carried no threat, no challenge, but also no apology. He was simply stating a fact. His presence would cause trouble. It always did. The silver dollar was compensation. "No trouble here," Emilio said carefully. "You're welcome to water, welcome to rest if you need it." The giant's eyes moved to the rangers, who had their hands on their pistols but hadn't drawn. "These men are law?" he asked. "Texas Rangers," Kent spoke up, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "And you're wanted for questioning in connection with several deaths." Questioning. The giant seemed to consider the word, rolling it around like one of the water glasses. "Is that what you call it, when you've already decided someone is guilty?" "I call it following the law." "Which law? Yours or mine?" It was the same question Hendricks had grappled with, but hearing it spoken aloud by the man himself gave it different weight. Kent had no answer. The giant turned back to Emilio. "I mean no harm to anyone here. I'm passing through. By tomorrow's dawn I'll be gone. But if these lawmen decide to try stopping me, people will be hurt. I don't want that." "I suspect you don't either." "Where are you going?" Sullivan asked, speaking for the first time. The giant looked at him, and for a moment something like sadness crossed his features. "Home, or what's left of it. The desert beyond the border. The mountains where my people still live free. You're Apache. I am Nantan of the Lipan Apache, son of Broken Arrow, grandson of he who speaks with thunder. I am the last of my family line, and I am going home." The way he said it carried finality, a sense of journey's end that was almost palpable. This wasn't a man running. This was a man completing something, finishing a circuit that had been interrupted, but was now being closed. Kent and Sullivan exchanged glances. They'd been tracking outlaws and criminals for years, had developed instincts for when men were lying or hiding something. This man was doing neither. He was simply stating truth as he understood it, leaving them to decide how to respond. "The men you killed," Kent began, "were men who'd earned death," Nantan interrupted. "Turner enslaved me, chained me like an animal, displayed me like property. Still water robbed the graves of my ancestors, sold sacred objects to white collectors who wanted souvenirs of dead Indians. Kingsley led the raid that killed my family, burned our village, shot children as they ran. Morrison hunted my people for bounty money, brought in scalps and called it justice." He paused, letting the litany of crimes settle. "I gave each of them a chance to understand what they'd done, gave them moments before the end to feel what their victims felt, terror, helplessness, the understanding that no mercy was coming. If that makes me a murderer in your eyes, then I'm a murderer. But in the eyes of my people, in the eyes of the land itself, I am simply a man who balanced scales that had been tipped too long in one direction." The silence that followed was profound. Even the cicadas outside seemed to have stopped their buzzing, as if the whole world was listening. Finally, Emilio spoke. "You want food? You look like you haven't eaten in days." Nantan's expression softened slightly. "I can't pay for food. The dollar is all I have. The water is free, always has been. The dollar buys food if you want it." For the first time since entering, Nantan smiled. It was a small thing, barely a lifting of the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his face, made him look younger, less carved from stone and more formed from flesh. "Thank you, yes. Food would be welcome. Emilio disappeared into the back room where his wife cooked for the saloon's customers. The rangers remained tense, hands still on their weapons, but neither moved to draw. Johnny had crept closer, his child's fascination with the extraordinary overcoming his fear. "Are you really 7 feet tall?" the boy asked in Spanish. Nantan looked down at him, and again that small smile appeared. "Nearly," he replied in the same language, his Spanish as flawless as his English. 6 feet 11 inches, last time someone measured me, before the chains. Did you really kill all those men by yourself?" "Johnny!" Emilio called from the back room, warning in his voice. But Nantan raised a hand. "It's all right. Children should ask questions. Yes, I killed them. By myself. With my hands, mostly. Sometimes with their own weapons turned against them. I wanted them to understand that all their guns and knives and chains meant nothing when facing someone who had nothing left to lose." "Were you scared?" Johnny asked. The question seemed to surprise Nantan. He considered it carefully before answering. "Yes, every time. Fear is what keeps us alive, keeps us careful. Only fools and dead men don't feel fear, but I was angrier than I was scared, and anger is a powerful thing when you've earned the right to it." Emilio returned with a plate of food, beans, tortillas, roasted meat. Nantan accepted it with a slight bow of his head, a gesture of respect that spoke to upbringing and culture that white settlers rarely acknowledged Indians possessed. He ate slowly, methodically, taking time to chew and taste, someone who'd learned not to take sustenance for granted. As he ate, people began to gather outside the saloon. Word had spread with the speed that only small towns achieve, and soon 30 or 40 residents stood in the street, watching through the windows, whispering among themselves. They kept their distance, but they watched, needed to see the myth made flesh, the legend made real. Nantan seemed unbothered by the attention. He finished his meal, drained another glass of water, and then stood, his height once again shocking in the close confines of the saloon. He looked at the rangers. "I'll be leaving now. You can follow me if you need to. You can try to stop me if your duty demands it. But I'm asking you, as one human to another, to let me go home. I've done what I came to do. I've sent the message I needed to send. Now I just want to walk into the desert, find what remains of my people, and live whatever days I have left in peace." Kent and Sullivan looked at each other. They were lawmen, had sworn oaths, had duties and responsibilities, but they were also men who'd seen enough of frontier justice to know that not everything worth catching was worth keeping. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing weren't the same thing. "How long to the border?" Sullivan asked. "Walking. I can be across by midnight. That's outside our jurisdiction." Kent nodded slowly. 12 hours. We'll give you 12 hours. After that, if anyone asks, we'll say we lost your trail in the desert." Nantan regarded them for a long moment, something like respect passing across his features. "Thank you. Your ancestors would have called it mercy. Mine would call it wisdom. Either way, it's appreciated." He moved toward the door, but Johnny stepped in front of him, holding out something. It was a small wooden cross, the kind sold in Mexican markets for a few centavos, carried for protection and comfort. "For your journey," the boy said, "so you'll be safe." Nantan took the cross carefully, his enormous hand making it look even smaller. He studied it for a moment, then tucked it into his coat. "Different gods," he said gently, "but the same hopes. Thank you, little one. May you grow tall and strong and never know chains." Then he was gone, ducking through the doorway and out into the evening air. The crowd parted before him, not fleeing but simply making space, acknowledging that this was something beyond their understanding, beyond their ability to judge or contain. Nantan walked through Presidio without looking back, heading west toward where the Rio Grande curved and the border waited. His shadow stretched behind him in the last rays of the sun, impossibly long, touching buildings and people and leaving them unchanged but somehow marked, as if his passage had blessed or cursed them in ways they wouldn't understand for years. By the time he reached the edge of town, the sun had set completely. He stopped at the final building, the church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and looked back. The entire town stood watching him, silhouettes against the lights of their homes and businesses. He raised one hand, a gesture that could have been farewell or blessing or warning. Then he turned and kept walking, his form gradually dissolving into the darkness until he was just another shadow among shadows, just another legend walking into the West where legends belonged. Inside Martinez's saloon, the Rangers sat in silence, their drinks untouched. Kent finally spoke, his voice quiet. "What do we put in the report?" Sullivan shrugged. "We tracked the suspect to Presidio. We attempted apprehension. Suspect fled across the border into Mexican territory, outside our jurisdiction. Pursuit was deemed inadvisable given political complications." That's a lie. That's close enough to truth to matter. Sometimes, Kent, close enough is all we get. They left the next morning, heading back toward Fort Clark, with a story that would add another chapter to the legend, another layer to the myth. And behind them, the town of Presidio slowly returned to its normal rhythms, though something had changed, something subtle but profound. They'd seen what fury looked like when it had righteousness on its side. They'd seen what happened when a man decided that his humanity was worth more than his survival. And they'd let him go. Not because they were scared, though some of them had been, not because they approved, though some of them did, but because sometimes the right thing to do was to step aside and let justice take forms that courtrooms and judges could never achieve. Nantan crossed the border that night, wading through the shallow waters of the Rio Grande under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. He climbed the far bank, stood for a moment looking back at the United States, at the land that had enslaved him and broken him and ultimately forged him into something new, something that existed between man and myth, between human and force of nature. Then he turned west one final time and walked into the desert, toward the mountains where his people still held on, toward whatever home meant for a man who'd become a legend, toward the end of a journey that had changed him in ways he was still discovering. The wind picked up, carrying his scent and his presence away, erasing his footprints as if the land itself was protecting him, hiding him, welcoming him back into spaces where white men's laws couldn't reach and older powers still held sway. And somewhere in that vast darkness, thunder rumbled, though the sky was clear and stars shone bright and no rain had fallen in weeks. The desert beyond the Rio Grande was a landscape that existed outside of time, a place where human concerns seemed small and temporary against the permanence of stone and sand. Nantan walked through it like a ghost, his enormous frame somehow at home in the vastness, his movements sure despite the darkness. He'd been born in these lands, had learned to walk on this earth, had absorbed its lessons through his skin before words had meaning. Coming back was like remembering a language he'd thought forgotten, but which had actually just been sleeping, waiting for him to need it again. By dawn, he'd covered 20 miles, moving with the steady, ground-eating pace of someone who'd learned to conserve energy, to move efficiently, to think of distance in terms of days rather than hours. The sun rose behind him, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange that seemed impossible, that looked like the desert was bleeding light. Ahead, the Sierra del Carmen mountains rose in purple majesty, their peaks catching the first rays of sun and transforming into something ethereal, something that might have been mountains or might have been the dwelling places of gods. He stopped at a seep, a place where water emerged from stone, where life concentrated in a small green circle against the browns and tans of everything else. He drank deeply, refilled a canteen he'd taken from one of Turner's men, and rested for an hour while the sun climbed higher. Around him, the desert woke. Lizards emerging from the shade, birds calling their territorial claims, insects buzzing in what passed for morning coolness before the real heat arrived. As he rested, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, the chain of events that had transformed him from captive to legend. The memories were painful, like pressing on bruises, but he'd learned that pain that wasn't acknowledged just grew stronger, more poisonous. Better to feel it, understand it, and then release it. He'd been born Nantan, Thunder, because his mother had gone into labor during the worst storm anyone could remember, had delivered him while lightning split the sky and rain fell so hard it seemed the world might drown. The medicine man had declared it an omen, though whether good or ill had remained unclear. His father, Broken Arrow, had taken it as a sign that his son would be powerful, would carry the strength of storms in his blood. Broken Arrow had been wrong about many things, but not about that. Nantan had grown quickly, his size apparent from infancy, his strength emerging as he aged. By 12, he'd been as tall as most adult men. By 15, he'd topped 6.5 feet. By 18, when the soldiers came, he'd reached his full height and had earned status among his people as a warrior, though he'd never killed anyone, had only defended hunting parties from raiders and predators. The soldiers had come in winter, when the Apache villages were most vulnerable, when food was scarce and cold made people slow. Captain Thomas Kingsley had led them, a man whose hatred of Indians was famous even among other Indian haters, a man who collected scalps and told himself he was bringing civilization to the wilderness. Nantan's village had been small, 40 people, mostly women and children and elders. The warriors were away hunting, leaving only Nantan and 3 others to defend the camp. They'd tried. God and the spirits and whatever other powers watched, such things knew they'd tried. But 4 men, even when one of them was Nantan's size, couldn't stop 50 soldiers with rifles. The massacre had lasted less than an hour. When it ended, 37 Apache were dead, including Nantan's mother, his 2 sisters, his grandmother, and his uncle. Nantan himself had been wounded, a bullet through his side that had cracked a rib and lodged near his spine. He'd fallen, had watched through dimming vision as Kingsley personally shot the 3 other defenders, had heard the screams of children being cut down as they ran. He should have died, would have died, if not for the soldier, Private Marcus Webb, barely 20, fresh from Massachusetts, and so horrified by what he was witnessing that his conscience had finally overridden his orders. Webb had found Nantan bleeding out, had dragged him into the mesquite, had covered him with branches and his own coat. "Stay quiet," Webb had whispered, his voice shaking. "Stay still, I'll come back. I promise I'll come back." But Webb hadn't come back. Couldn't come back. Kingsley had discovered what he'd done, had called it desertion and treason, had had him shot 2 days later and his body left for the crows. Nantan had learned this only later, much later, when he'd tracked Kingsley and heard the story from another soldier, one who'd been there and whose guilt had eaten at him until he'd needed to confess. Nantan had survived alone in the desert for 3 weeks, his wound slowly healing, his spirit slowly hardening into something new, something that had no name in either English or Apache. When he'd finally been strong enough to move, he'd traveled south, looking for other Apache, looking for some remnant of his people who might take him in. Instead, he'd been found by Turner. The farmer had been tracking a lost calf, had stumbled across Nantan, half-conscious by the creek, had seen not a man, but an opportunity. By the time Nantan understood what was happening, he'd been chained and loaded onto a wagon, too weak to fight, too wounded to run. And then had come the months of captivity, the days of being displayed like property, the nights of planning and waiting and gathering strength. The breaking of the chains had been almost anticlimactic. Nantan had been working on them for weeks, every night flexing and pulling, testing their limits, learning their weaknesses. The metal had been good quality, but no chain was stronger than the weakest link, and Turner had been sloppy, had used connecting rings that were slightly smaller than the main links, had created a vulnerability that patient testing had revealed. When the chains finally parted, on that night when the sky split with lightning and thunder rolled like drums, Nantan had felt something break inside him that was bigger than the chains, deeper than the metal. He'd felt the last restraints of his humanity snap, felt himself transform into something that existed between man and force, between person and principle. What followed had been methodical, even ritualistic. He'd freed the animals first. They were innocent, had done nothing to deserve captivity. Then he'd gone to the house where Turner slept, drunk and snoring, and he'd done what needed to be done. Not quickly, though that would have been easier. Not cleanly, though that would have been kinder. But thoroughly, making sure Turner understood in his final moments what it felt like to be powerless, to be property, to have your humanity denied and your pleas ignored. The dirt in Turner's mouth had been symbolic, forcing him to swallow the land he'd claimed to own, making him understand that the earth belonged to no one, that all claims of ownership were temporary and ultimately meaningless. The stones crushing his skull had been practical, ensuring death but also sending a message about the weight of cruelty, about how the rocks themselves would rebel against injustice. After Turner, the others had been easier, not because Nantan enjoyed killing, he didn't, but because each death felt like righting a scale, like restoring balance that had been knocked askew. Stillwater with his grave robbing, Kingsley with his massacres, Morrison with his bounty hunting. Each of them had earned what they received, had spent years accumulating a debt that Nantan had simply collected. Now, sitting by the seep in the Mexican desert, Nantan wondered if it had been worth it. The revenge had been satisfying in the moment, had felt righteous and necessary, but it hadn't brought back his family, hadn't undone the massacre, hadn't changed the fundamental truth that his people were being destroyed, slowly or quickly but inevitably, by the expansion of white settlement. All he'd done was become a story, a legend, a cautionary tale that white people would tell each other to justify their fear of Indians and their conviction that Indians needed to be controlled or eliminated. He'd proven their point in a way, had shown them that yes, Indians were dangerous, yes, they were savage, yes, they would kill white men if given the chance, except that wasn't the real story. The real story was more complicated, was about cause and effect, was about actions having consequences, was about the difference between savagery and justice. But Nantan knew that nuance rarely survived the translation into legend. Stories simplified, complexities were shaved away until only the most dramatic elements remained. He would be remembered as the giant who killed farmers, not as the man who'd been enslaved, as the monster who'd crushed skulls, not as the survivor of a massacre, as the Apache devil, not as Nantan, son of Broken Arrow, grandson of he who speaks with thunder, last of his family line. The sun climbed higher, and Nantan resumed his journey. The mountains drew closer with each mile, their slopes becoming more defined, their canyons and ridges resolving from purple suggestion into brown reality. Somewhere in those mountains, if the stories were true, were the remnants of the Lipan Apache who'd managed to avoid capture or death, who still lived according to the old ways, who might welcome one more survivor into their dwindling numbers. He walked through country that became increasingly familiar as the day progressed, landscapes that triggered memories of hunting trips taken as a boy, of lessons learned from his father about reading signs and understanding weather and moving through the land without disturbing it. The memories were bittersweet, reminders of a life that had been possible once, but which now seemed as distant as the stars. By afternoon he'd entered the foothills, trading the flat desert for rising terrain, for slopes covered in pinyon and juniper, for air that smelled of resin and carried sounds differently than the open plains. He moved cautiously now, aware that he was approaching territory that might be watched, might be guarded, might contain people who would see his size and his scars and make assumptions before asking questions. He found the first sign at a place where 3 canyons met, a rock cairn with specific arrangements that meant something to Apache eyes, but looked like random stones to anyone else. The message was simple: friends welcome, enemies warned. Choose carefully. Nantan studied the cairn, noting details that told him approximately how long ago it had been built, which way the builders had travelled afterward, how many people had been involved in its construction. The stones were relatively fresh, maybe 2 weeks old, which meant people had been here recently, were likely still in the area. He rearranged 3 of the stones, creating a response. Son of Broken Arrow seeks shelter and peace. Then he continued up the middle canyon, moving slower now, keeping his hands visible, making enough noise that anyone watching would hear him coming. Surprising armed people who were on edge about intruders was a good way to get killed, and Nantan had survived too much to die from simple stupidity. He walked for 2 hours, climbing steadily, following a trail that was barely visible even to his trained eyes. The canyon narrowed, its walls rising steep on either side, the sky becoming a ribbon of blue overhead. And then, rounding a bend where water trickled from a crack in the rock, he found them. 23 Apache, survivors of multiple bands that had been decimated over the past years, gathered here in this hidden canyon where water and game were sufficient to sustain a small group. They looked up as he appeared, hands moving to weapons, bodies tensing for fight or flight. But then one of them, an elderly woman whose face was a map of wrinkles and whose eyes still held the sharpness of youth, stood and walked toward him. She stopped 10 feet away, studying him with an intensity that felt like it was looking through flesh and bone to something deeper. "Nantan," she said finally, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Thunder that walks. We've heard your stories, heard what you did to the ones who hurt our people." "Grandmother," Nantan replied, using the term of respect for any elder. "I seek only shelter. I'm tired of fighting, tired of being angry. I just want to be among my people again, if you'll have me." The old woman smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. "You think we'd turn away someone who did what you did? You think we'd refuse the man who made the white farmers scared to sleep at night? You're a hero, Nantan. You're what we all wish we could be, free and fearless and ready to make them pay." The words should have felt like vindication, like validation, like everything he'd done was worthwhile. But instead, they sat heavy in his chest, another weight added to all the others. Because he wasn't free, he was running. He wasn't fearless, he was scared of what he'd become. And he hadn't made them pay so much as added more bodies to a count that was already too high, that stretched back centuries and would continue forward who knew how long. But he didn't say any of this. Instead, he nodded, accepted the welcome, allowed himself to be led into the camp where food was offered and shelter provided and questions asked, that he answered as truthfully as he could, without destroying their image of what he represented. That night, sitting around a fire while stars wheeled overhead and the canyon walls held in warmth and conversation, Nantan listened to stories of survival, of resistance, of small victories won against impossible odds. And he realized that his own story, his own legend, was part of something larger, a narrative of a people refusing to disappear, refusing to be erased, refusing to accept that their time had passed. He was Nantan, thunder that walks, the giant who'd broken his chains and taken revenge on those who'd wronged him, but he was also just a man, tired and scarred and carrying memories that would never fully heal. Both things were true. Both things would remain true for however long he lived. And maybe that was enough. Maybe being a symbol for others, while remaining human for himself, was the only victory possible in a world that reduced people to stories, and stories to lessons, and lessons to weapons in ongoing wars. As the fire burned down and people drifted toward sleep, the old woman approached him again. "You'll stay?" she asked. "For a while," Nantan replied, "until they come looking. They'll come eventually. Men like the Rangers don't give up on legends. And when they come, I'll lead them away. I won't bring danger to people who've already suffered enough. And if they catch you," Nantan smiled, though there was no humor in it, "then I become a different kind of story. The giant who was caught, who was hanged or shot, who proved that even thunder can be stopped. But until then, I'll rest here. I'll remember what it's like to be among family. I'll pretend just for a little while that I'm still the boy who was born during a storm and who his mother hoped would grow strong and good." "You did grow strong," the old woman said gently. "Yes, but the good part—" Nantan looked up at the stars, at the infinite distance between here and there. "That's still being decided." 3 months passed before they came. 3 months during which Nantan lived among his people, relearned rhythms he'd thought forgotten, participated in hunts and councils and the daily work of survival. He was careful never to stay in the main camp, instead keeping to the ridges above, watching over them like a guardian spirit, but never allowing his presence to make them vulnerable to association with his crimes. The Apache accepted this arrangement. They understood that Nantan's legend, while useful for morale, was also dangerous for anyone too closely connected to it. So he remained apart, visible enough to be real, but distant enough to be deniable. A ghost who helped with hunts and occasionally shared stories, but who vanished when strangers approached. It was a young scout named Two Hawks who brought warning. He'd been ranging far to the east, watching the trails that led from Texas into the Mexican territories, when he'd spotted them. A military patrol, 20 soldiers led by Lieutenant Foster, the same man who'd been part of the original investigation months earlier. They were moving slowly, asking questions in every village and settlement they passed, showing a sketch of a giant man and offering rewards for information. "They're 2 days behind me," Two Hawks reported to the gathered group. "Maybe less if they push hard. They know we're here. Someone told them about the hidden canyons, about survivors gathering in the Sierra del Carmen." The camp dissolved into urgent discussion. Some argued for fleeing deeper into the mountains, for abandoning the camp and dispersing into smaller groups that would be harder to track. Others suggested fighting, arguing that 20 soldiers could be ambushed and defeated if the terrain was chosen correctly. The old woman, whose name was Nalin, listened to all suggestions before turning to where Nantan sat slightly apart from the group. "This is your doing," she said, and though her voice held no accusation, the fact remained. "They wouldn't be coming if not for you, so you decide. Stay, and we all risk capture. Flee, and you lead them away from us. Fight, and some of us will die. Which will it be?" Nantan had known this moment would come, had been preparing for it since the night he'd arrived. He'd made his choice then, had known what it would require of him. Standing now, his full height making everyone else seem small by comparison, he announced his decision. "I'll go to them. Alone. I'll surrender myself and draw them away. With luck, they won't even come close enough to discover you're here." The camp erupted in protest. Several warriors stood, hands on weapons, ready to argue that no Apache should surrender to white soldiers, that death in battle was preferable to capture. But Nalin raised her hand for silence, her authority absolute despite her age. "You would sacrifice yourself for us?" she asked Nantan. "I would end what I started," he replied. "The killing, the revenge, the legend, it all ends with me. You've lost enough. You've suffered enough. I won't be the cause of more suffering." "They'll hang you," said a warrior named Standing Bear, a man who'd lost his entire family to soldiers and whose hatred of whites was legendary. "They'll make a spectacle of it. They'll use your death to scare other Indians, to prove that resistance is futile." "Perhaps," Nantan agreed, "or perhaps they'll simply shoot me and bury me and try to forget the questions my existence raised. Either way, you'll be safe. That's what matters." He spent the next day saying farewells, though few words were needed. The Apache understood necessity, understood sacrifice, understood that sometimes the greatest act of courage was knowing when to stop fighting. Nalin gave him a medicine bag, small leather pouch containing herbs and stones and items of spiritual significance. "To remember who you are," she said. "Not the legend, not the giant, just Nantan, son of our people." Two hawks insisted on accompanying him part of the way, arguing that someone needed to witness what happened, to carry the truth back to the camp so they would know how the story ended. Nantan agreed, grateful for the company, even though he knew the young scout was also positioning himself to fight if soldiers tried to kill Nantan before he could surrender. They descended from the mountains at dawn, retracing the path Nantan had climbed 3 months earlier. The journey that had taken him hours of steady climbing took nearly a full day to descend, his pace deliberately slow, giving the soldiers time to find him rather than him having to find them. They made camp that night in a small clearing near where the foothills transitioned back into desert. Two hawks built a fire despite Nantan's suggestion that they stay dark. "If they're close, let them see us," the young scout said. "Let them know you're not hiding, that you're done running." The soldiers arrived at midnight, surrounding the camp so quietly that Nantan didn't hear them until Lieutenant Foster's voice called out from the darkness, "Nantan, we know you're there. Show yourself." Nantan stood slowly, hands held away from his body, making sure they could see he was unarmed. Two hawks started to rise as well, but Nantan put a hand on his shoulder, pressing him back down. "Stay. Watch. Remember." He walked toward Foster's voice, moving into the firelight where they could see him clearly. The soldiers emerged from the darkness, rifles raised, forming a circle around him. Even prepared for his size, several of them gasped when they saw him fully illuminated by flames, his shadow stretching across the clearing like something cast by a mountain rather than a man. Foster stepped forward, his young face trying for authority, but succeeding mostly in looking nervous. "Nantan, also known as Thunder That Walks, you are under arrest for the murders of Ezekiel Turner, Jacob Stillwater, Thomas Kingsley, Edward Morrison, and others. You will be returned to Texas to face trial." "No trial," Nantan said quietly. "I did what I'm accused of. I killed those men. I don't deny it. I don't regret it, but I'm done now. Whatever punishment you decide is appropriate, I'll accept. Just leave the people in these mountains alone. They've suffered enough." Foster seemed surprised by the confession, by the lack of resistance. He'd been prepared for violence, for a fight, possibly for death. This calm acceptance threw off whatever script he'd rehearsed. You're confessing." "I'm acknowledging truth. Those men earned their deaths through their actions. I gave them what they gave to others, terror, pain, understanding that mercy wasn't coming. If your law calls that murder, then I'm a murderer. If it calls it justice, then I'm an executioner. Either way, I'm guilty of what I did." One of the soldiers, an older sergeant named Williams, lowered his rifle slightly. "Lieutenant, this ain't right. Man's surrendering peacefully. That should count for something." "He killed American citizens," Foster replied, though his voice held less conviction than his words suggested. "He killed men who'd murdered his people," Williams countered. "I was at Fort Clark when the reports came in about what Kingsley did to that Apache village. Wasn't war, was massacre, women and children. If this man's family died there, can't say I blame him for what he did after." "Our job isn't to judge," Foster began. "Then what is our job?" Nantan interrupted. "You hunt men like me because we refuse to accept that your laws apply to us, that your concept of property includes our land and our bodies and our very existence. But we never agreed to those laws. We never signed treaties saying you could take everything we had and we'd simply accept it. So tell me, Lieutenant, whose law matters here, yours or mine? And if you say yours, on what authority? Because you have more guns? Because your government decided this land was yours to claim? Because your God told you it was acceptable to destroy anyone who stood in your way?" The questions hung in the air, unanswerable because any honest answer would undermine the very foundation of what Foster represented. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Finally, Foster spoke, his voice quiet. I don't have answers to those questions. I'm just a soldier following orders. But those orders say I'm to bring you back to Texas for trial, so that's what I'm going to do. Then do it, Nantan said. Chain me if you must, though I'd ask that you not. I won't run. I won't fight. I give you my word. Foster looked at Sergeant Williams, who shrugged. Man's word is probably worth more than chains anyway. He wanted to fight. We'd already be fighting. They made camp there for the night, the soldiers taking turns on watch, though Nantan sat peacefully by the fire, occasionally speaking quietly with two hawks in Apache. When dawn came, they began the journey back toward Texas, a strange procession, 20 armed soldiers escorting one unarmed giant who walked as if he was leading them rather than being led by them. Two hawks followed at a distance for the first day, then turned back toward the mountains, carrying with him the story of Nantan's surrender, the truth that would eventually become part of the legend. The giant had chosen peace over violence, had sacrificed himself for his people, had proven that strength wasn't just about fighting, but also about knowing when to stop. The journey to Fort Clark took 12 days. As they traveled, something unexpected happened. The soldiers began talking with Nantan, not interrogating him, just talking. They asked about his people, about his life before Turner, about what it had been like to be displayed like property. And Nantan answered, honest and direct, painting a picture of a world the soldiers had never considered, a perspective they'd never been exposed to. By the time they reached Fort Clark, half the patrol believed they were escorting a hero rather than a criminal. The other half remained uncertain, caught between their orders and their growing understanding that justice was more complicated than they'd been taught. Colonel Hendricks met them at the fort's gates. He'd aged in the months since issuing his original orders, his hair grayer, his face more lined. He looked at Nantan for a long moment, then at Foster, then back at Nantan. So you came, Hendricks said. I came, Nantan confirmed, of my own choice, to end this. The territorial judge arrives next week. There will be a trial. You'll have an opportunity to defend yourself. I don't need to defend myself. I need to explain. There's a difference. Hendricks nodded slowly. Indeed there is. Indeed there is. They locked Nantan in the fort's stockade, though the chains they used were light and the guards were instructed to treat him with respect. Word spread quickly that the legend had been captured, that the giant Apache was imprisoned at Fort Clark awaiting trial. People came from miles around to see him, to stare through the stockade's bars at the man who'd become a myth. Nantan endured their attention with the same patience he'd shown for everything else. He sat in meditation most days, his massive frame somehow looking peaceful rather than threatening. When people asked questions, he answered. When they hurled insults, he remained silent. When children came, curious and unafraid, he would tell them stories about the desert and the mountains and the animals that lived there. The trial, when it finally happened, was a farce, and everyone knew it. The judge, a territorial appointee named Harrison Blackwood, had already decided the verdict before hearing any testimony. The evidence was clear. Nantan had killed multiple people. That he'd had reasons, that those people had committed crimes against his people, was deemed irrelevant. Murder was murder under territorial law, but Nantan was given an opportunity to speak before sentencing, and he used it wisely. I don't ask for mercy, he said, his voice carrying through the packed courtroom. I don't claim innocence. I killed those men deliberately, methodically, with full understanding of what I was doing. They earned those deaths through their own actions, through enslaving me, through robbing graves, through murdering children, through hunting my people for bounty money. But I'm not here to justify my actions. I'm here to bear witness, to make sure someone remembers that the violence you condemn me for was a response to violence committed against me and mine, that the justice you deny me was denied to thousands of my people. That the laws you claim I violated are laws we never agreed to, imposed on us by force and maintained through terror, Hang me if you must. Shoot me. Put me in prison for the rest of my life. But know this, I am not the first to resist, and I won't be the last. For every man like me you capture or kill, others will rise. Maybe not as tall, maybe not as strong, but carrying the same truth I carry, that being human means refusing to accept inhumanity, even when that refusal costs everything. I am Nantan, son of Broken Arrow, grandson of he who speaks with thunder, last of my family line. I will die as I lived, unbroken, unbowed, and believing that the chains you put on me say more about you than they ever said about me. The courtroom sat in stunned silence when he finished. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and pronounced sentence, death by hanging, to be carried out in 1 week's time. But something had changed in that courtroom, something subtle but profound. The people who'd come expecting to see a monster had instead seen a man. A huge, scarred, dangerous man, yes, but unmistakably human. Unmistakably dignified, unmistakably something more complex than the simple savage they'd been taught to fear. The week before the execution saw an unexpected development. Petitions began circulating, signed by both settlers and soldiers, asking for clemency. Letters arrived at Fort Clark from as far away as Washington, some demanding Nantan be hanged immediately, others arguing for a pardon, most simply asking that someone pay attention to what his case revealed about territorial justice and treatment of indigenous peoples. Colonel Hendricks found himself in an impossible position. His orders were clear: execute the condemned prisoner. But his conscience, increasingly troubled, whispered that following those orders would make him complicit in something that history might judge harshly. The night before the scheduled execution, Hendricks visited Nantan in his cell. The giant sat in meditation, his enormous frame somehow peaceful in the small space. I could let you escape, Hendricks said without preamble. Could leave the door unlocked. Could look the other way while you slipped into the desert. Could report that you overpowered the guards and fled. Nantan opened his eyes, regarded the colonel with something like pity. And then what? I spend the rest of my life running? More soldiers come hunting? More innocent people get caught in the search? No. This ends tomorrow. One way or another, it ends. You're not afraid of dying. I've been dead since the day they chained me in Turner's barn, since the day Kingsley murdered my family, maybe even before that. This, he gestured at the cell, at himself, this is just making it official. Then what was the point? The revenge, the killing, the resistance. If it all ends with you hanged in a fort courtyard, what did it accomplish? Nantan smiled, and for the first time since his capture, it reached his eyes. It accomplished truth, Colonel. It forced people to see what they'd been pretending not to see. It made the invisible visible. It turned a nameless slave into Nantan, into thunder that walks, into a story that will be told long after both of us are dust. That's not nothing, that's everything. The execution was scheduled for dawn. Half the territory seemed to have arrived to witness it, packing the fort until guards had to turn people away. Some came from morbid curiosity, some came from hatred. But many came from something else, a need to witness history, to be present for a moment that felt significant in ways they couldn't articulate. Nantan walked to the gallows without assistance, his chains removed, his bearing dignified. The platform creaked under his weight, built for average men and straining to support someone of his size. He stood calmly while the noose was fitted around his neck, looking out at the assembled crowd with what might have been curiosity or might have been judgment. Judge Blackwood read the sentence, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. When he finished, he asked the traditional question, "Do you have any final words?" Nantan looked west, toward the mountains where his people were hiding, where two hawks would be waiting to hear how the story ended. Then he looked at the crowd, at the hundreds of faces watching him. "I forgive you," he said simply, "all of you, for the chains, for the slavery, for the massacres, for the lies and the broken treaties and the theft of everything we had. I forgive you because carrying that anger was destroying me, turning me into exactly what you claimed I was, a savage, a monster, something less than human. I won't die as that. I'll die as Nantan, as a man who refused to be property, as someone who fought back when fighting back seemed impossible. And I'll die forgiving you, because that's the only victory left to claim." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Then the trapdoor opened and Nantan fell, and the legend became complete. Except the rope snapped. The platform had been built for men of average weight, and Nantan was anything but average. The rope, already old and weakened by years of Texas sun, couldn't support his mass and speed combined. It parted with a crack like a gunshot, and Nantan crashed to the ground below the gallows, stunned but alive. For a long moment, nobody moved. It was as if the universe itself had paused, uncertain how to proceed. Then Sergeant Williams stepped forward, helped Nantan to his feet, and said in a voice that carried across the silent courtyard, "I'll be damned. Even God thinks this is wrong." The crowd erupted. Some shouted for the execution to continue. Others called it a sign. Arguments broke out. Fistfights started. In the chaos, Colonel Hendricks made a decision that would define the rest of his military career. He ordered the prisoner returned to his cell and announced that the execution would be postponed pending review. That review never came. Over the following weeks, pressure mounted from unexpected quarters. Churches began preaching about redemption and mercy. Newspapers editorialized about the complexities of frontier justice. Former soldiers wrote letters describing atrocities they'd witnessed or participated in. The story of Nantan became a lens through which people examined their own actions, their own complicity in systems they'd never questioned. 2 months after the failed execution, a courier arrived from Washington with a presidential pardon. Not an exoneration. Nantan's crimes were still crimes. But a recognition that circumstances mattered, that context was essential, that justice was more complicated than courtrooms could accommodate. The pardon came with conditions. Nantan would be exiled from American territories, forbidden from ever returning. He would be escorted to the Mexican border and released into the custody of Apache representatives who'd agreed to ensure he caused no further trouble. The escort consisted of Colonel Hendricks, Lieutenant Foster, Sergeant Williams, and 4 other soldiers who'd been part of the original capture. They traveled slowly through country that had become familiar over the past year, retracing paths that Nantan had walked as both fugitive and prisoner. At the Rio Grande, where he'd crossed months earlier, they found 2 hawks waiting with 10 Apache warriors. The young scout had aged in the intervening months, his face harder, his eyes more cautious. But when he saw Nantan alive and walking free, joy transformed his features. "The story said you died," 2 hawks said in Apache. "The story said you forgave them and they killed you anyway." The story was